Of all the things a person can be haunted by, I find that silence is the most unforgiving. It's not the absence of noise that gets to you, it's the presence of everything that noise used to cover up. For me, the silence was shaped like my wife, Eleanor. It sat in her chair at the breakfast table, it walked beside me in the sprawling, manicured gardens of our estate, and it lay beside me in a bed that suddenly felt as vast and as cold as a forgotten sea. I was Alistair Finch, a name that appeared in financial papers and on the side of skyscrapers, but in the quiet solitude of my own life, I was simply a ghost, rattling the chains of my own success. The world saw a titan of industry, a man who could move markets with a single phone call. But what they didn't see was the man who had forgotten the sound of genuine laughter, a man for whom joy had become a foreign currency he no longer knew how to trade. My days were a meticulous procession of empty victories. Board meetings in sterile glass towers, handshakes that lacked warmth, and dinners where the clinking of cutlery was the only real conversation. I had built an empire of steel and concrete, but in the process, I had constructed a fortress around my own heart. Eleanor had been the one with the key. She had been the one who could find the cracks in my armor and plant flowers there. But 2 years ago, a sudden illness had taken her from me, and the fortress had become a tomb. One Tuesday afternoon, the hollowness was particularly acute. I had just concluded a deal worth 9 figures, a supposed triumph that left me feeling nothing but weary. My colleagues, a pack of younger, hungrier versions of my former self, were slapping me on the back, their faces flushed with the thrill of the win. They suggested a celebratory drink at some exclusive, ridiculously expensive bar in Mayfair. The thought of it made my soul ache. The loud music, the performative happiness, the endless talk of money, it was the very architecture of my loneliness. So, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I lied. I told them I had another engagement, a family matter. The word family felt like ash in my mouth. I dismissed my driver, telling him I wanted to walk. The crisp London air felt like a shock to my system. I just started walking, with no destination in mind, letting my feet carry me away from the gleaming towers of Canary Wharf, away from the life I had so carefully and so meaninglessly built. I walked for what felt like hours, my expensive leather shoes scuffing on unfamiliar pavement. The neighborhoods changed. The pristine storefronts of designer brands gave way to smaller, family-run shops with faded awnings. The scent of exhaust fumes mingled with the smell of baked bread and roasting spices. I was in a part of the city that didn't care about my net worth. I was just a man in an impeccably tailored suit that suddenly felt like a costume. It was then that I saw it. Tucked between a laundromat and a dusty bookshop was a small café. Its sign, painted in gentle, looping script, read The Rose Petal Café. A warm, golden light spilled from its windows, a stark contrast to the encroaching gray of the London evening. It looked kind. It was a word I hadn't associated with a place in a very long time. On an impulse I couldn't explain, I pushed open the door. A small bell chimed, a sweet, simple sound. The air inside was thick with the aroma of coffee and cinnamon and something else, something like home. The place was small, filled with mismatched wooden tables and chairs. There were a few patrons scattered about, an elderly couple sharing a scone, a young student hunched over a laptop. And behind the counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth, was a woman. She looked to be in her early 60s, her hair a mix of silver and pale gold, tied back in a simple, practical bun. Her face was a beautiful map of a life fully lived, with fine lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and tears. She wore a simple apron over a faded floral dress, and her hands, though busy, moved with an unhurried grace. She looked up as I entered, and her eyes, a clear, intelligent blue, met mine. There was no awe, no recognition of the face plastered on magazine covers. There was just a simple, welcoming neutrality. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Find a seat wherever you're comfortable. I'll be with you in a moment." I chose a small table in the corner, feeling impossibly large and out of place. My suit felt stiff, my silence felt loud. I watched her as she moved about the cafe. She refilled the elderly man's teacup, sharing a small joke that made him chuckle. She placed a plate of biscuits beside the student, saying brain food. On the house. There was an economy to her movements, a deep-seated competence that was calming to watch. After a few moments, two of my colleagues, who had evidently followed me out of some misguided sense of loyalty or curiosity, burst through the door. Their names were Mark and Julian, and their presence shattered the café's gentle peace like a thrown stone. Alistair, there you are. Julian boomed, his voice echoing in the small space. What on earth are you doing in a place like this? We thought you'd gotten lost. Mark surveyed the room with a sneer. Bit of a step down from the Goring, isn't it? Do they even have a wine list? I felt a hot flush of embarrassment. They were treating this haven like a curiosity, a zoo exhibit. The woman behind the counter, the waitress, simply continued her work, her expression unreadable. Julian, fueled by a lunchtime of expensive wine and his own self-importance, leaned against my table. Come on, Alistair. Let's go somewhere proper. This is quaint. He said the word quaint as if it were an insult. And then, a strange, cruel impulse took hold of me. It was born of my own misery, of my frustration with them, with myself. I wanted to shock them. I wanted to do something utterly absurd, something that would break the monotony of my predictable existence. I looked at the waitress, who was now approaching our table, a small notepad in her hand. I leaned back in my chair, affecting an air of detached amusement. Actually, gentlemen, I began, my voice laced with a cynical drawl, I'm in the middle of some very important business. Mark and Julian exchanged a confused glance. I looked directly at the woman. Her blue eyes held mine, steady and waiting. I was just about to ask this lady for some financial advice, I said, a smirk playing on my lips. You see, I have a few billion pounds lying around, and I'm simply at a loss as to what to do with it all. So, tell me, I gestured expansively at her, my good woman, as a joke for my friends here, what should a man like me do with his fortune? The words hung in the air, heavy and ridiculous. Mark and Julian snickered, ready for the punchline. The elderly couple looked over with disapproving frowns. The cafe fell silent, the only sound the gentle hum of the coffee machine. I expected her to be flustered, perhaps angry, or to offer some meek, predictable response. Instead, she stood there for a long moment, her gaze never leaving my face. There was no anger in her eyes, only a deep, penetrating stillness, as if she were looking past the billionaire, past the suit, and into the vast, empty chamber of my soul. The smirk on my face began to feel like a mask made of cracking plaster. Then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Before you can grow your money, sir, she said softly, you must first understand what it has cost you. The laughter died in Julian's throat. Mark's grin vanished. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Her words weren't financial advice. They were an indictment. They were a mirror held up to the hollow man I had become. In that instant, she had seen everything. The lonely mansion, the empty chair, the ghost of Eleanor, the price I had paid for my empire. My breath caught in my chest. I was Alistair Finch, the man who was never surprised, the man who had an answer for everything. And a waitress in a small cafe, with a single sentence, had left me completely and utterly speechless. The silence that followed her words was different from the one in my mansion. It wasn't empty, it was full. It was filled with the weight of her question, a question that echoed in the deepest, most neglected corners of my heart. What had it cost me? The answer was immediate and brutal. It had cost me time. It had cost me moments. It had cost me the last few years with Eleanor, years I had spent chasing one more deal, one more acquisition, believing we had an eternity. Julian, ever the buffoon, broke the spell. Cost him, he scoffed, trying to regain his footing. It's cost him nothing. It's given him everything. He gestured around the humble cafe. Certainly more than this. But I wasn't listening to him. I was still looking at the waitress. Her gaze was not one of judgment, but of a sad, profound understanding. It was the look of someone who knew the true arithmetic of life, where the things you lose are often more significant than the things you gain. Get out, I said, my voice low and strained. What? Mark asked, taken aback. I said, get out. Both of you. Leave, I repeated, my eyes still locked on the woman. I waved a dismissive hand, not even bothering to look at them. I heard them sputtering, confused and insulted, but they eventually shuffled out, their expensive shoes scuffing on the floorboards as they retreated back to a world I no longer wanted to be a part of. The little bell on the door chimed their departure, and peace descended once more. The waitress hadn't moved. She just stood there, her notepad still in her hand, as if waiting for my order. I apologize, I managed to say, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. That was inexcusable. My behavior. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. We all have our moments of foolishness, sir. The important thing is what we do after them. She finally gestured to the menu on the table. Can I get you something? A coffee, perhaps? You look like you could use one. Yes, I said quickly. Coffee. Black. She went to the counter, and I watched her, my mind reeling. Who is this woman? How could she have seen me so clearly? When she returned with the coffee, her hands were steady. She placed the cup and saucer on the table with a quiet clink. I took a sip. It was strong, hot, and real. It was the first thing I had tasted all day that didn't feel like a phantom. My name is Alistair, I said, by way of a proper introduction. I'm Clara, she replied, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. It's a pleasure to meet you properly, Alistair. Clara, I repeated the name. It suited her. What you said, about the cost. She pulled out the chair opposite me and, after a moment's hesitation, sat down. The cafe was quiet now, most of the other patrons having left. It's the only financial advice I have to give, she said simply. It was advice my husband gave me a long time ago. Your husband? I asked, intrigued. Was he a banker? An accountant? A genuine, warm laugh escaped her, and for a second, the lines on her face were all from joy. Goodness, no. Robert was a carpenter. He worked with his hands. He used to say that some men have rich bank accounts, but he had rich hands. They were covered in sawdust and calluses, but they built our home. They held our son when he was born. They held me when I cried. He believed the real value of a thing wasn't its price, but the story it held. She looked at her own hands, resting on the tabletop. They were not smooth or manicured. They were the hands of a worker, a carer. When he passed, she continued, her voice softening, he didn't leave me a fortune. He left me a house full of memories, a rocking chair he made, and the lesson that you measure wealth not by what you accumulate, but by what you can't bear to lose. Her words were a series of gentle blows against the walls of my fortress. A carpenter with rich hands. My own hands felt smooth, sterile, and empty. They signed checks and tapped on keyboards. They hadn't built anything that truly mattered. They hadn't held Eleanor enough. My wife, Eleanor. I began, the name catching in my throat. She passed away 2 years ago. She used to say I was building a kingdom, but I was forgetting to live in it. Clara's expression softened with empathy. I'm so sorry for your loss. It's a difficult road to walk alone. It is, I admit it, the confession a relief. The silence is the worst part. I know the silence, she nodded. Mine is shaped like my son, Daniel. My heart clenched. Your son. He passed 3 years ago. A construction accident. He was a good boy, a wonderful father. She looked towards the door, as if expecting someone. I look after his son now. My grandson, Leo. He's 10. He'll be here soon, after his art class. Suddenly, her story unfolded not as a tragedy, but as a testament to resilience. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a widow, a grieving mother, a guardian. She was working in this cafe, on her feet all day at an age when she should be resting, to provide for her grandson. And yet, she possessed a grace and a wisdom that I, with all my billions, couldn't even begin to comprehend. I started visiting the Rose Petal Cafe every day. It became my ritual, my confessional. I would leave my sterile office, shed my corporate skin, and sit at that small corner table. I would drink Clara's strong, black coffee, and we would talk. I told her about Eleanor, about our early years when we had nothing but loved each other fiercely. I told her about the intoxicating climb to the top, and how, with each rung I ascended, I seemed to move further away from the woman I was doing it all for. Clara, in turn, told me about her life. She spoke of Robert the carpenter and the simple, profound happiness they had shared. She talked about Daniel's passion for life and the terrible void his absence had left. And she spoke of Leo, her bright, talented grandson who loved to draw more than anything in the world, but was becoming quiet and withdrawn, missing the father he barely remembered. Her struggles were immense. The pension she and Robert had saved was wiped out in a market crash years ago, a crash from which my own companies had profited handsomely. The thought was a dagger in my gut. She worked double shifts to afford the rent on their small flat and to pay for Leo's art classes, which she saw as the one spark of joy in his young life. Yet, she never complained. She never expressed bitterness. She spoke of her hardships as one might speak of the weather, as a fact of life to be navigated, not a reason for despair. Her focus was always on what she had, not what she had lost. She had Leo. She had her memories of Robert and Daniel. She had the community of the café, the regulars who were like her extended family. You see, Alistair, she told me one afternoon, as she refilled my cup, my ledger is still in the black. The love I've had, the love I still have for my grandson, it outweighs all the loss. The interest it pays is joy. It's a different kind of portfolio. I was learning a new language from her, the language of the heart, the portfolio of joy, the currency of love. My world, once measured in stock prices and profit margins, was beginning to be recalibrated. I started to notice things I had been blind to for years. The beauty of the sunset over the Thames, the taste of a simple, well-made pastry, the kindness in a stranger's smile. One day, I met Leo. He came into the cafe after his class, his small face smudged with charcoal. He was a quiet boy with his mother's eyes, full of a deep, thoughtful melancholy. He showed his grandmother his sketchbook, and I saw a talent that was raw and astonishing. He drew the world not as it was, but as it felt. There was a drawing of the cafe, warm and bustling. There was a drawing of his grandmother, her face radiating a quiet strength. And there was a drawing of a man, tall and indistinct, sitting alone in a vast, empty room. It was a drawing of me. Seeing my loneliness reflected through the eyes of a child was a profound shock. It was in that moment I knew I couldn't just be a spectator in Clara's life anymore. I had to do something. But the old Alistair would have just written a check. It would have been easy, impersonal, and ultimately insulting to the dignity of a woman like Clara. The new Alistair, the one being tutored by a wise waitress in a London cafe, knew he had to offer something more. He had to apply her first piece of advice. He had to understand the cost, and then he had to invest in something that would truly grow. And I was beginning to have an idea of what that investment might be. The idea began as a whisper in my mind and grew into a quiet, determined resolve. For weeks, I had been a student in Clara's world, learning about a different kind of wealth. Now, it was time for me to use the tools of my own world, not to acquire, but to preserve. Not to conquer, but to nurture. The old me would have seen Clara's financial precarity as a problem to be solved with a blunt instrument, cash. A wire transfer, an anonymous donation. It would have been an act of charity, but also an act of distance, a way of salving my conscience without truly getting involved. It would have changed her circumstances, but it would have broken the delicate, respectful bond we had forged over countless cups of coffee. Clara had never asked for a thing. Her pride was a quiet, unshakable pillar of her character. To simply hand her money would be to misunderstand everything she had taught me. It would be an insult to the memory of Robert the carpenter, who built his life with his own two hands. Clara's wealth was her independence, her resilience, her community. My challenge was to help her without taking any of that away. The catalyst for my plan came on a gray Wednesday morning. I arrived at the cafe to find Clara looking unusually distressed. The usual calm in her blue eyes was replaced by a storm of worry. She was standing behind the counter, staring at a letter in her hand, her face pale. The elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Gable, were talking to her in hushed, concerned tones. "What is it, Clara?" I asked, my own heart sinking at the sight of her pain. She looked up at me, her composure faltering for the first time since I'd known her. It's the building, Alistair, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Henderson, the landlord, he passed away last month. His children, they've sold the entire block to a development corporation. She handed me the letter. It was cold, corporate, and brutal. A company called Apex Properties had acquired the building and was terminating all existing leases in 90 days. They planned to demolish the block to make way for a luxury apartment complex. The Rose Petal Café, the bookshop, the laundromat, all of it was to be erased. 90 days, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. This place, it's been here for 40 years. It's more than my job. It's home. For me, for the Gables, for so many people. I looked around the small, warm cafe. I saw not just a business, but an ecosystem of kindness. This was the place where the lonely found a moment of connection, where the weary found a moment of rest. It was the heart of this small, forgotten corner of London. And a faceless corporation, one very much like my own, was about to rip it out. The irony was a bitter pill. Apex Properties, I knew them. I had done business with their CEO. He was a ruthless operator, a younger, more aggressive version of who I used to be. In that moment, a quiet fury rose within me. It wasn't just about Clara anymore. It was about the Gables, who had been coming here since they were newlyweds. It was about the student who got free biscuits and a kind word. It was about Leo, who saw this place as a safe extension of his home. It was about Robert the carpenter's legacy of building things that last. Apex Properties saw a plot of land to be monetized. I, thanks to Clara, saw a community to be saved. Let me handle this, I said, my voice steady and firm. Clara looked at me, a flicker of hope warring with her despair. What can you do? They're a massive company. We can't fight them. You can't, I agreed gently. But I can speak their language. That afternoon, I didn't go back to my office. I went to a different one, a private office I kept for my more discreet dealings. I put my old life on like a familiar, well-worn suit. I made a call to the CEO of Apex Properties, a man named Richard Sterling. Alistair, he said, his voice slick with feigned deference. To what do I owe the pleasure? Richard, I began, my tone cool and measured. I hear you've acquired the block on Kenilworth Street. Yes. A prime piece of real estate. We have big plans. Highest-end residential. The returns will be astronomical. I'm sure they will be, I said. But you have a problem. I want that block. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You want it? Alistair, with all due respect, the deal is done. We're not selling. Everything has a price, Richard, I said, the old, cold words flowing easily. You and I both know that. Name yours. I want the deed, free and clear, by the end of the week. He tried to argue, to posture, but he knew he was outmatched. I had deeper pockets, more influence, and for the first time in a long time, a purpose that went beyond profit. I wasn't just negotiating for land. I was fighting for a principle. I was fighting for the Rose Petal Café. I offered him a price that was ludicrous, a number so high it would be corporate malpractice for him to refuse. It was a fraction of my fortune, but it would change the fate of an entire community. He accepted. But buying the building was only the first step. The old Alistair would have stopped there. He would have become the new landlord, perhaps given Clara a lifetime lease. But that would still make her beholden to me. It would turn our friendship into a transaction. I had to remember Clara's lesson. I had to invest in something that would grow. So I did something more complex. I spent the next 2 weeks in a whirlwind of legal activity, working with a team of my most trusted lawyers, not the corporate sharks, but the ones who handled my estate and philanthropic endeavors. We didn't just transfer the deed into my name. We established a new legal entity, the Kenilworth Street Community Trust. The trust's charter was a work of art, a document born from Clara's wisdom. It stated that the block of buildings was to be held in perpetuity for the benefit of the community. The trust would be the landlord, and its mandate was not to maximize profit, but to foster and protect small, independent businesses that served the local residents. Rents would be fixed, tied to inflation, not the whims of the market. A portion of the rental income would be funneled back into a fund for the upkeep of the properties and for community improvement projects. And the board of the trust? I appointed myself as a silent, non-voting chairman. The voting members were to be a panel of local residents and business owners. The first name on my list for the board of directors was Clara. The final piece of my plan was for Leo. I had seen his talent, the raw, untamed brilliance in his sketches. That kind of gift needed nurturing. So I used my foundation, the one I had established in Eleanor's name, but had largely ignored, to create a new scholarship. The Eleanor Finch Grant for Young Artists. It was designed to provide full funding for a promising young artist to attend the most prestigious art school in the country, all the way through university, including living expenses and materials. The selection committee was to be composed of curators from the Tate and the National Gallery. And the first, pre-approved, non-negotiable recipient of the grant was to be Leo. A month after that dreadful letter had arrived, all the pieces were in place. The contracts were signed, the trusts were established, the funds were allocated. I had used the immense power of my wealth not to dominate, but to empower. Not to erase, but to build. I walked into the Rose Petal Café on a Friday afternoon. It was busy, the familiar hum of conversation a comforting melody. Clara saw me and her face fell slightly, assuming I had no news, or worse, bad news. The 90-day deadline was looming, a dark cloud on their horizon. Alistair, she said quietly, wiping her hands on her apron. Any word? Let's sit down, I said, gesturing to our usual table. Leo was there, sitting in the corner, sketching in his book. When we were seated, I slid a large envelope across the table. Clara, I began, my voice softer than I intended. You're not losing the cafe. She looked at me confused. Did you talk to them? Did they give us an extension? More than that, I said. I pushed the envelope closer. Apex Properties no longer owns this building. Or any of the buildings on this block. Her eyes widened. Who does? A community trust does, I explained. A legal entity designed to protect this street forever. Rents are frozen. No one is being evicted. The Rose Petal Cafe is safe. She slowly opened the envelope. Inside were the legal documents establishing the trust. She read through them, her brow furrowed in concentration. She saw the name, the Kenilworth Street Community Trust. And then she saw the list of board members. Her finger traced over her own name. Tears welled in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming, disbelieving relief. I don't understand. Who would do this? I finally met her gaze. The first piece of financial advice you ever gave me, I said, my voice thick with emotion, was to understand what my money had cost me. The second lesson you taught me, without ever saying a word, was to understand what it could be worth. Her hand flew to her mouth as the realization dawned on her. Alistair, you? I bought it, I admitted. But I don't own it. The community does. You do. I simply made an investment. I invested in this place. In the Gables. In the future of this street. I invested in you. She was crying freely now, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. But why? This is too much. No, it's not, I said, my own eyes stinging. For years, my money was just a number on a screen. It was cold. Lifeless. You taught me how to make it warm. You taught me how to give it a purpose. This isn't charity, Clara. This is the best investment I've ever made. The returns are incalculable. I then slid a second, smaller envelope across the table. And this is for Leo. She opened it and read about the Eleanor Finch Grant. She saw the full scholarship, the prestigious school, the opportunity for her grandson to have a future she could only have dreamed of. She looked over at Leo, who was oblivious, lost in his world of charcoal and paper. She looked back at me, her face a canvas of emotions too complex to name. You named it after your wife. Eleanor would have loved this, I said, the words a quiet tribute. She would have loved you. She always wanted our wealth to be a force for good, for beauty. It took me too long to listen to her. It took me meeting you to finally understand what she meant. Clara stood up, walked around the table, and wrapped her arms around me. She held me in a tight, heartfelt embrace. It wasn't the polite, distant hug of a society acquaintance. It was the embrace of a friend, of family. It was warm and real, and in that moment, standing in the middle of a small London cafe, surrounded by the scent of coffee and cinnamon, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. The ghost in the mansion was finally starting to fade. I wasn't just Alistair Finch, the billionaire. I was Alistair, a friend of Clara's. I was the silent chairman of a trust that protected a community. I was a man who had finally learned the true meaning of wealth. The days that followed that conversation were a quiet revelation. The oppressive silence of my grand house began to recede, replaced by a different kind of quiet, a peaceful, reflective stillness. The ghost of Eleanor no longer haunted her empty chair. Instead, I felt her presence as a gentle, approving warmth. I had finally done something she would have been proud of, something that honored her spirit far more than any cold, marble monument ever could. I had taken the vast, impersonal fortune I had amassed and used it to protect something small, personal, and profoundly human. The news spread through the small community on Kenilworth Street not like a thunderclap, but like the slow, steady warmth of a sunrise. There was no grand announcement, no press release. I had insisted on anonymity. Clara, respecting my wishes, simply told the other tenants that the building had been purchased by a benevolent trust dedicated to preserving the neighborhood. There was celebration, of course, but it was a quiet, deeply felt joy. The relief on the faces of Mr. and Mrs. Gable, the gratitude from the man who ran the bookshop, it was a dividend far greater than any my stock portfolio had ever yielded. My visits to the Rose Petal Café continued, but their nature had changed. I was no longer an outsider, a curiosity in a suit. I was part of the fabric of the place. Clara no longer saw me as a project or a puzzle. She saw me as a friend. We still talked for hours, but our conversations roamed far and wide. We talked about books, about the changing seasons, about our memories of the people we had loved and lost. We talked about Leo's excitement for his future, his eyes now shining with a hope that had been absent before. He would show me his new drawings, and I would see a world bursting with color and life. The solitary man in the empty room was gone from his sketchbook, replaced by sketches of the cafe, bustling with smiling faces. One afternoon, Clara sat down across from me, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, Alistair," she began, "when you first walked in here, I saw a man who was drowning. Not in debt, but in abundance. You had so much, you couldn't see what any of it was for. I was lost," I admitted, looking into my coffee cup. "More lost than I ever knew." "We all get lost," she said kindly. "The trick is to find a landmark to steer by. For me, it was always my family. My love for them. I think you found yours now too." She was right. My landmark wasn't a building or a bank account. It was a principle. It was the idea that true value isn't held, it's shared. It was the understanding that my legacy wouldn't be the height of my skyscrapers, but the strength of the foundations I could help lay for others. The Kenilworth Street Community Trust was just the beginning. Inspired, I turned my attention to my own foundation. For years, the Eleanor Finch Foundation had been a dormant entity, a tax write-off that made token donations to respectable charities. Now, I saw it as a powerful engine for change. I restructured the entire organization, away from funding galas and towards grassroots initiatives. We started funding community gardens in forgotten neighborhoods, music programs in underfunded schools, and mentorship schemes for young people from difficult backgrounds. My days were no longer filled with hostile takeovers and market speculation, but with meetings with community leaders, artists, and educators. I was building a different kind of empire, one measured in lives touched and futures brightened. I sold my sprawling, soulless mansion. The silence there had been defeated, but the space itself was a relic of a life I no longer lived. I moved into a more modest, though still very comfortable, apartment overlooking the Thames. It was filled with light, and I filled it not with expensive, impersonal art, but with photographs of Eleanor, of my parents, and, in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, one of Leo's early charcoal sketches of the Rose Petal Café. About a year after I first walked into the cafe, Clara hosted a small party to celebrate its anniversary under the protection of the trust. The place was packed. The Gables were there, laughing with the bookshop owner. The student I'd seen on my first day, now a recent graduate, was helping Clara serve drinks. Leo, taller and more confident, moved through the crowd, showing his latest portfolio to admiring neighbors. I stood in the corner, nursing a cup of tea, just watching. I wasn't the center of attention. Most people there still had no idea of the role I had played. To them, I was just Alistair, Clara's quiet friend who liked his coffee black. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Clara caught my eye from across the room and smiled, a radiant, genuine smile of pure contentment. In that single look, a universe of understanding passed between us. It was a look that said thank you, a look that said well done, a look that said welcome home. I had come into this cafe a joke, a cynical billionaire looking to mock the world that he secretly envied. I had asked for financial advice as a cruel jest. And in return, I had received a lesson that had fundamentally rewired my soul. Clara, with her simple, profound wisdom, had given me the keys to a kingdom far more valuable than the one I had built for myself. She had taught me that the cost of my wealth had been my connection to humanity, and she had shown me how to reinvest it to get that connection back. As the evening wore on, I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The street, once threatened with demolition, was alive. Lights glowed in the shop windows. People strolled along the pavement. There was a sense of peace, of permanence. I thought about the word rich. I used to associate it with balance sheets and stock tickers. Now I associated it with the sound of laughter coming from the cafe, with the look of hope in a young boy's eyes, with the quiet dignity of a woman who knew the difference between price and value. My fortune was still vast, but it no longer felt like a burden. It was a tool. A responsibility, a potential for good. I had learned that true wealth isn't what you keep in a vault, it's what you give away, what you build in the hearts of others. It's the richness of a life that connects, that contributes, that cares. It was a lesson I had to travel a long, lonely road to learn. A lesson that started with a foolish question, born of misery, and ended in a redemption I never thought possible. A lesson that finally, after all these years, brought me home. There's a common misconception that great change happens like a lightning strike, a single, dramatic event that alters the landscape of your life forever. And while my first encounter with Clara at the Rose Petal Cafe certainly felt that way, I've since learned that true transformation is a quieter, more patient process. It's less like a lightning strike and more like the turning of the tide. You don't notice it from one moment to the next, but over time, you look up and realize the entire shoreline has been redrawn. The jagged rocks of your past have been smoothed by the persistent, gentle waves of a new reality. Several years had passed since the day I, a titan of empty industry, had been brought to my knees by the simple wisdom of a waitress. The Kenilworth Street Community Trust was no longer a fledgling idea, but a thriving reality. The street was safe, its small businesses flourishing under the gentle stewardship of a board that valued community over profit. Clara, initially hesitant, had become its heart, her practical wisdom and deep empathy guiding their decisions with a grace that no corporate boardroom could ever replicate. The Eleanor Finch grant had sent Leo, no longer a quiet, withdrawn boy but a gangly, passionate teenager, to one of the finest art academies in the country. His letters and calls to Clara were filled with the thrill of discovery, his world expanding with every brushstroke. And me? I was Alistair, a man redefined. The fortress of my former life had been dismantled, brick by lonely brick. My days were no longer a relentless pursuit of more, but a quiet cultivation of enough. I ran the foundation in Eleanor's name with a newfound purpose, channeling my resources into projects that planted seeds of hope in overlooked corners of the city. My new apartment, overlooking the river, was a home, not a showroom. Its walls held the story of my second chapter, and my friendship with Clara was its central narrative. We had settled into a comfortable, familial rhythm. I would still visit the cafe several times a week, but now I would sometimes help clear tables or chat with the regulars, no longer an object of curiosity, but a familiar fixture. Clara and I would take long walks in Hyde Park, speaking of everything and nothing. She told me about the ache of pride and sorrow that came with watching Leo step into his own future, a bittersweet pain I understood all too well. I spoke of Eleanor, not with the sharp agony of fresh grief, but with the warm glow of cherished memory. We were two souls who had found in each other a safe harbor from the storms of loss. We were family, chosen and forged in the crucible of shared vulnerability. It was a life of quiet contentment, a life I fiercely protected. My involvement in saving Kenilworth Street remained our secret. To the world, I was a reclusive philanthropist. To the residents of the street, I was just Alistair, Clara's friend. This anonymity was precious. It kept the arrangement pure. It ensured that Clara's dignity and that of the entire community remained intact. They were not my charity case. They were the architects of their own resilience. I had simply provided the tools. But the past, I've learned, is rarely content to remain in the past. It has a way of sending out search parties. Mine arrived in the form of a young journalist named Sophie Reed. She was ambitious, sharp, and had a nose for the stories that lurked beneath the surface of things. She was writing a series on London's changing landscape, on the battle between corporate development and community preservation. Her research led her, inevitably, to the miraculous story of Kenilworth Street, a block of prime real estate snatched from the jaws of a corporate leviathan, Apex Properties, and mysteriously turned over to the community. Her first article was a human interest piece, praising the resilience of the residents and centering on the beloved café. She interviewed Clara, who spoke eloquently about the importance of community. But Sophie Reed was too good a journalist to be satisfied with just the fairy tale. She was interested in the fairy godmother. The court records were public, if buried. She found the name of the initial purchaser, a shell corporation. And she had the skills and resources to trace that shell corporation back to its source. Back to me. The first inkling of trouble came when Clara called me one evening, her voice laced with a subtle unease. "Alistair," she said, "that journalist, Miss Reed, she was back in the café today." She was asking strange questions. Strange how? I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "She kept asking about you," Clara said. "How we met. How long we've known each other. She asked Mrs. Gable if you were a regular benefactor. And then she mentioned Apex Properties. She asked if I knew who had really bought the building." The tide was turning again, but this time, it was threatening to pull everything out to a cold and unforgiving sea. My carefully constructed piece felt fragile, like a sandcastle about to be washed away. "What did you tell her?" I asked, my voice tight. "I told her the truth," Clara replied calmly. "That you are my dear friend. That the building is owned by a trust." I didn't say anything more. But Alistair, she knows something. I could see it in her eyes. She looks at things like she's trying to solve a puzzle. Over the next few weeks, the pressure mounted. Sophie Reed was a ghost at the edge of my new life. She spoke to my former colleagues, men like Julian, who, I was sure, would be more than happy to paint my transformation in the most cynical light possible. Alistair Finch doesn't get sentimental. I could almost hear him sneering. There's always an angle. She requested an interview with me through my foundation's office, citing her story on the philanthropic evolution of Alistair Finch. I declined, of course, which I knew would only fuel her suspicions. The fear that coiled in my gut was not for myself. I was long past caring what the financial papers said about me. My fear was for Clara, for Leo, for the Gables, for the sanctity of what we had built. I imagined the headlines: Billionaire's pet project, the Waitress, and the neighborhood he bought. I saw the story being twisted into a condescending narrative of a rich man playing God with the lives of the less fortunate. It would rob Clara of her agency, her strength. It would turn the Rose Petal Café into a tourist attraction, a place where people came to gawk at the billionaire's favorite charity. It would poison the well of our friendship, introducing the power imbalance I had worked so hard to erase. It would, in essence, undo everything. The stress began to wear on me. The old silence, the one shaped like grief, started creeping back into the corners of my apartment. I found myself becoming distant, withdrawn, even with Clara. I was trying to protect her by pulling away, a foolish, male instinct that I should have known better than to indulge. She confronted me one rainy afternoon in the cafe. It was quiet, the air smelling of wet pavement and fresh coffee. "Alistair, talk to me," she said, sitting at my table without being asked. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world again. I thought we'd put that ghost to rest. I couldn't lie to her. I owed her more than that. I told her everything. About Sophie Reed's investigation, the public records, my fears of what the story would do to them, to us. Clara listened patiently, her blue eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, a torrent of anxious words tumbling into the quiet of the café, she didn't look scared or angry. She looked disappointed, but not in the situation. In me. So you think our friendship is so fragile it could be broken by a newspaper article? She asked, her voice soft but firm. You think my dignity, or the dignity of this community, is a secret that needs to be kept? You think my gratitude for what you did could be turned into resentment because the world finds out about it? Her questions were gentle, but they struck me with the force of a physical blow. I had been so focused on controlling the narrative, on protecting the purity of my grand gesture, that I had failed to trust in the very people I was trying to protect. I had underestimated Clara. What you did, Alistair, she continued, leaning forward, was not about money. It was an act of love, an act of friendship. It was born from the conversations we had in this very cafe. It was born from your grief for Eleanor and my grief for Robert and Daniel. It was real. A journalist's words can't change what is real. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was warm, her grip steady. You are not the man who first walked in here. That man would have sent his lawyers to crush this reporter. He would have hidden behind his power. But you learned a different way. You learned to connect, to be vulnerable. Don't forget that lesson now. Don't hide. Talk to her. Talk to her. I was aghast. And say what? Confirm her cynical theories. No, Clara said, a small, wise smile playing on her lips. Tell her the truth. Not the facts of the transaction, but the truth of the story. Your story. Our story. Trust that the truth is powerful enough. Her faith in me was a lifeline. It pulled me back from the edge of my own fear. She was right. Hiding was the old Alistair's move. The new Alistair, the one Clara had helped to build, had to face this with openness and honesty. That evening, I called my office and told them to arrange the interview with Sophie Reed. But I had two conditions. First, it would not be at my office or hers. It would be at the Rose Petal Café after hours. Second, I would only do it if Clara was there with me. This wasn't just my story to tell. A few nights later, the three of us sat at that familiar corner table. The cafe was dark, save for a single lamp that cast a warm pool of light around us. Sophie Reed was poised, her recorder on the table, her eyes sharp and questioning. She looked from me, the enigmatic billionaire, to Clara, the quiet waitress, trying to complete her puzzle. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Mr. Finch, she began, all professional politeness. I'll be direct. My research shows that you are the ultimate benefactor behind the Kenilworth Street Community Trust. I want to know why. Why would a man like you, known for his ruthless business acumen, pour millions into saving a small and profitable block of shops? The old Alistair would have bristled at the word ruthless. But now I just nodded. Because the ruthless businessman you're referring to is a man who didn't understand the meaning of profit, I said, my voice calm. I looked at Clara, who gave me a subtle, encouraging nod. And then I told Sophie Reed the truth. I didn't talk about financial structures or shell corporations. I told her about Eleanor. I told her about the suffocating silence of my life after she was gone. I told her about walking into this cafe on the worst day of my life, a hollow man in an expensive suit. I told her about the cruel, foolish joke I made, asking a waitress for financial advice. And I told her about the advice Clara gave me. She told me, I said, my voice growing thick with emotion, that before I could grow my money, I had to understand what it had cost me. In that moment, a woman I had never met, a woman I was trying to mock, held up a mirror to my life. And the reflection was unbearable. I told her about Clara's story, about her carpenter husband, her lost son, and her fierce love for her grandson. I explained the concept of a portfolio of joy, a ledger where love outweighed loss. You're asking me why I poured millions into this street, Miss Reed, I said, my gaze steady. You have it backwards. I didn't pour millions in. I was trying to pay a debt. This woman, I gestured to Clara, who sat with a quiet, powerful dignity, gave me something my billions could never buy. She gave me back my humanity. She taught me that wealth has no value until you use it to enrich the lives of others. Saving this street wasn't a business transaction. It was the first real investment I ever made in my life. Sophie Reed was silent. Her journalistic poise had slipped. She wasn't looking at a puzzle anymore. She was listening to a confession of a love story, a testament. The anonymity, I concluded, was never about hiding. It was about respect. This community's victory belongs to them, not to me. It belongs to their resilience, their history, their love for this place. I was just a catalyst. Clara is the foundation. Clara then spoke for the first time, her voice clear and strong. What Alistair did was give us back our home, Miss Reed. But what this community gave him was a place to belong. We saved each other. That's the only part of the story that really matters. Sophie Reed slowly reached out and turned off her recorder. Her eyes were glistening. That's not the story I came here for, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But it's the one I'm going to write. A week later, her article was published. It was titled The Portfolio of Joy. It told the story of Kenilworth Street, of a community that stood against the tide of corporate greed. It spoke of a beloved café and its wise owner, Clara, who measured wealth in cups of coffee and kind words. It mentioned a quiet, anonymous benefactor, a man who had lost his way and found it again in the heart of a small London neighborhood. It never once mentioned my name. Sophie Reed had understood. She had chosen the harder, more truthful story over the sensational headline. She had protected our peace. That evening, I was at the cafe. A copy of the newspaper lay on the table between Clara and me. She's a good writer, Clara said, folding the paper neatly. She's a good person, I corrected. She chose kindness over ambition. Perhaps you taught her something, too, Clara smiled. Just then, the phone behind the counter rang. Clara went to answer it. I watched her, her face lighting up. It was Leo. I could hear the excitement in her voice as she listened. When she hung up, she was beaming. That was Leo, she said, walking back to the table. He's won the Academy's annual prize. His final project. He gets a solo exhibition at a gallery in Soho. Clara, that's wonderful, I said, my heart swelling with pride for the boy I'd come to see as a nephew. That's not all, she said, her eyes shining with tears of joy. He wants us to come to the opening. And he told me the name of his exhibition. She paused, taking a breath to steady herself. He's calling it The Cost and the Worth. In that moment, the tide had come full circle. The words Clara had spoken to me years ago, words that had saved me from my own gilded cage, had now become a legacy of their own, passed down to the next generation, transformed into art, into beauty, into hope. I looked at Clara, her face a beautiful map of a life rich beyond all measure, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was the wealthiest man on earth. My ledger was overflowing. I used to think that the grandest gestures in life were loud. The signing of a monumental deal, the dedication of a skyscraper, the thunderous applause of a boardroom. I believed that significance had to announce itself, that worth was measured in decibels and headlines. But the most profound moment of my later years arrived not with a roar, but with the quiet rustle of a heavy paper invitation, its elegant script announcing the debut exhibition of an artist named Leo. The title, printed in a simple, clean font beneath his name, was The Cost and the Worth. The evening of the gallery opening felt like a pilgrimage. Clara was a portrait of nervous, beaming pride. She had spent an hour deciding what to wear, finally settling on a simple, dark blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. It was a dress she'd saved for a special occasion that, for years, she thought would never come. As I helped her with her coat in the hallway of her small flat, I saw in her reflection not the weary waitress I had first met, but a woman stepping into a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. A joy she deserved more than anyone I knew. For my part, I felt a tremor of anxiety I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the thrill-seeker's fear I'd felt before a hostile takeover. It was something more fragile, more human. I was about to witness the culmination of a story I had stumbled into by accident. Leo's art was the final entry in a ledger that had begun with a cruel joke. I was afraid of what I would see. Afraid that the reflection would be too honest, too piercing. Afraid that I was an imposter in this world of genuine feeling, a man of commerce trespassing in a temple of the soul. The gallery in Soho was a world away from the Rose Petal Café. It was a minimalist space of white walls, polished concrete floors, and stark, focused lighting. The air was thick with the scent of wine, expensive perfume, and the faint, clean smell of oil paint and turpentine. The crowd was chic and artistic, their conversations a low, sophisticated murmur. Clara gripped my arm a little tighter as we stepped inside, her eyes wide. "My goodness, Alistair," she whispered. "It's another world." "It's Leo's world now," I replied, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. We moved through the gallery, letting the art guide us. It was breathtaking. Leo had not just painted pictures, he had painted feelings. There was a portrait of Clara's hands, not as old or worn, but as maps of a life of love and labor, cradling a steaming cup of coffee as if it were the most precious object in the world. There was a painting of the cafe at night, rain streaking the windows, the light from within a beacon of warmth against the cold, dark street. He had captured its essence perfectly. It was not just a place, but a sanctuary. There were darker pieces, too. Abstract canvases of tangled, angry lines that spoke of loss and confusion. I saw Daniel in them. I saw Robert. I saw Eleanor. I saw the universal language of grief, rendered in shades of charcoal and deep, wounded crimson. And then I saw a familiar, unwelcome face. Standing in front of one of Leo's abstract pieces was Julian, my former colleague. He was with a younger woman, both of them holding glasses of champagne. He hadn't seen me. He was squinting at the canvas with a look of utter disdain. "I don't get it," he said loudly to his companion. "It's just a bunch of messy scribbles. They call this art? My toddler could do better. What's it even supposed to be?" "It's called The Silence," the woman read from the plaque. "Pretentious nonsense," Julian scoffed, taking a large gulp of his champagne. "Probably costs a fortune, though. People will buy anything these days." He was the ghost of my past, a living embodiment of the man I used to be, a man who could only see the price tag, who was blind to the value. A cold rage, an old and familiar feeling, began to rise in me. I wanted to walk over there, to tell him exactly what that painting meant, to explain that it represented a grief so profound it couldn't be captured in anything but messy scribbles. But then I looked at Clara. She had seen him too. She simply shook her head gently, her expression not of anger, but of pity. Her silent message was clear. He doesn't matter. He can't touch this. She was right. His ignorance couldn't diminish the power of Leo's work. His cynicism couldn't tarnish the truth of this moment. I took a deep breath, released the anger, and let him fade back into the background noise. He was a relic. I was not. We turned a corner, leaving him behind, and walked into the gallery's main room. And that's when I saw it. It was the centerpiece of the exhibition, hanging alone on the largest wall. It was a diptych, two large canvases side by side, forming a single, narrative whole. The painting on the left was dark, almost suffocating. It depicted a vast, opulent room, cold and empty, with a single, towering window looking out onto a sterile city of glass and steel. In the center of the room sat a man in an impeccably tailored suit, but he had no face. He was a hollow shape, a void, a silhouette of success, and a monument to loneliness. It was the drawing Leo had made of me all those years ago, now fully realized in oil and shadow. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, "The Cost." My breath hitched in my throat. It was my tomb, my fortress, my life before Clara. My eyes moved to the canvas on the right. The scene was the corner table at the Rose Petal Café. The light was warm, golden, spilling from an unseen lamp. The details were rich and loving, the slight chip on the rim of the coffee cup, the worn texture of the wooden table, the menu leaning against the sugar bowl. And at the table sat two people. A woman with silver gold hair and kind, intelligent eyes, her hands wrapped around her own cup. And opposite her, the man in the suit. But he was different now. He was leaning forward, listening. His shoulders were no longer rigid with tension. And he had a face. It was my face, rendered with an almost painful honesty, the lines of grief and weariness still there, but his eyes were clear, and they were fixed on the woman with an expression of dawning hope. Of salvation. The plaque beneath this canvas read, "The Worth." Tears streamed down my face. I didn't even try to stop them. This was not an indictment. This was an absolution. This young man, this boy I had helped, had seen my entire journey. He had seen the cost of my life, the crushing weight of my success, but he had also seen the worth. He had seen that the worth wasn't in the billions, or the buildings, or the power. The worth was in a cup of coffee. The worth was in a moment of connection. The worth was in Clara. Clara stood beside me, her own eyes wet. She didn't say a word. She just slipped her hand into mine. We stood there for a long time, just looking. It was the story of my life, told by a boy who owed me everything and to whom I owed even more. He hadn't just painted a picture. He had given my life meaning. He had given my grief a purpose. A moment later, Leo himself appeared at our side. He was no longer a boy. He was a tall, handsome young man, his face flushed with the success of his evening, but his eyes held the same thoughtful depth they always had. "Grandma." "Alistair," he said, his voice quiet despite the surrounding noise. He looked at me, then at the painting, and a flicker of nervousness crossed his face. I hope it's okay." "Okay." I finally found my voice, though it was thick and unsteady. "Leo, it's the truest thing I've ever seen." "I remember that first drawing I did of you," he said softly, only for us to hear. "The man in the big empty room." It made me sad. I felt like I knew what that loneliness felt like after my dad. And then I saw you at the café with Grandma. And you started to change. It was like watching someone come back into focus. I wanted to paint that. The feeling of coming home. He had understood it all. The transaction of money had been transformed into a transmission of empathy, passed from me to Clara, from Clara to Leo, and now from Leo, back to me, in the form of this incredible, beautiful gift. "Your father would be so proud of you, my love," Clara whispered, pulling him into a fierce hug. "And your grandfather Robert, he would have said you build things with your heart, just like he did with his hands." Later that evening, after the crowds had thinned, I found myself alone with the painting again. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my wallet. From a hidden compartment where I had kept it for years, I took out a small, folded photograph of Eleanor. It was from our honeymoon, long before the empire was built. We were young, happy, and had nothing but each other. I looked from her smiling face in the photograph to the painting of the man finding his way out of the darkness. I finally understood, my love, I whispered to the photograph. It took me a while, but I finally understood what it was all for. The story had reached its final chapter. Not an ending, but a quiet, peaceful plateau. Life went on in its simple, beautiful way. The cafe still smelled of coffee and cinnamon. Mr. and Mrs. Gable still shared their scone every afternoon. And I still sat at my corner table, talking with my dearest friend. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a month after the exhibition, Clara and I were sitting in our usual spot. The golden light of late afternoon streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. We were quiet, a comfortable silence that had long ago replaced the dreadful one of my past. "You know," I said, looking around the warm, bustling room. "It's funny. I spent my whole life trying to build an empire that would last forever. Towers of steel and glass, companies with my name on them. I thought that was legacy." Clara smiled, a knowing, gentle smile. "And now?" I looked at her, at the map of a life well lived etched on her face. I thought of Leo, painting his truth in a bright studio. I thought of the couple in the corner, safe in their daily ritual. I thought of Eleanor, and the peace I had finally made with her memory. "Now," I said, my voice filled with a profound and settled gratitude. "I know that legacy isn't what you build. It's what you nurture. It's not about being remembered. It's about being a part of something that continues to grow long after you're gone. The little bell on the door chimed, and a new customer came in, looking for warmth against the autumn chill. Clara went to greet them, her movements filled with that same unhurried grace I had noticed on the very first day. I watched her, the heart of this small, wonderful world. My first piece of advice from her had been a question: what did your money cost you? Now, after all these years, I finally had the answer to the unspoken second half of that question. What is it truly worth? It was worth this. This peace. This friendship. This feeling of being home. The silence in my life was gone, not replaced by noise, but by the gentle, steady hum of a world I had helped to protect, and a family that had, in turn, protected me. My name is Alistair Finch, and I am, finally, a truly wealthy man.